The grand chandelier sparkled above the dining hall, spreading golden light over the polished marble floor. A long table stretched from one end of the room to the other, covered with white linen that looked untouched by time. Crystal glasses reflected the glow of tall candles, and silver cutlery lay arranged with exact precision. Everything in this room shouted of wealth, success, and power. The man at the center of it all was Adrian Cole, a millionaire whose name was whispered in business circles with both respect and envy. His wealth had grown from bold deals, ruthless strategies, and a talent for making people fear him. Tonight he had invited powerful guests, politicians, entrepreneurs, and socialites who wanted to be close to his influence. For Adrian, this dinner was not just a meal. It was a performance, a stage on which he played the role of king. But the story did not begin with the chandeliers or the polished silver. It began with a woman who worked quietly in the shadows of that very room. Her name was Grace. She was dressed in a plain black and white maid's uniform, moving silently between chairs, serving dishes, and refilling glasses. Grace carried herself with dignity, even though she knew she was invisible to the people she served. To them, she was only a servant, someone whose face they would not remember, someone whose presence only mattered when their plates were empty. Grace had been working for Adrian's household for several months. She came from a background where nothing was handed easily. Her days were long, starting before sunrise and ending long after the last light in the mansion was turned off. She worked not only for herself, but for her younger brother and her aging mother. Every coin she earned mattered. She knew her place in this world was not one of glamour, but she never allowed hardship to steal her inner pride. Adrian, however, was not a man who valued humility. He believed wealth was proof of superiority, and anyone without it was beneath him. That night, as his guests laughed and exchanged stories of profits and vacations on yachts, Adrian's eyes occasionally turned to Grace with a mixture of boredom and disdain. To him, she was nothing but a symbol of service, a shadow in the background. The tension began with something small. Grace accidentally placed a wine glass a little too close to the edge of the table. One of the guests shifted his arm and the glass nearly tipped. Adrian noticed, and though nothing actually spilled, his sharp eyes caught the detail. A smirk spread across his lips. He had found his target for the evening. "Grace," he said loudly, making sure the entire table went silent. His voice carried not only command but also cruelty. "Do you know how to set a table, or is this too complicated for you?" A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some laughed politely, not wanting to be on the wrong side of their host. Grace froze for a moment, then bowed her head slightly. "I apologize, sir. I will be more careful." Her calm response only seemed to fuel Adrian's arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the power he felt over her. "Apologies are cheap," he sneered. "Maybe you should focus harder instead of drifting off in your little daydreams." Grace did not argue. She adjusted the glass and continued her work. But the laughter that followed from some of the guests burned in her ears. She was used to being overlooked, but open humiliation was a wound that cut deeper. Minutes later, the main course was served, large plates of steaming pasta with rich sauces. Grace carried them carefully, one by one, moving gracefully despite the weight. But Adrian had not finished his performance. As she passed by him with a plate, he reached out suddenly, stopping her in her tracks. "Wait," he said, raising his voice again. "Do you even know how to serve food properly?" Grace looked at him calmly, though inside her heart trembled. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. Adrian smirked, then in one shocking move, he tilted the plate and let the pasta slide onto her head. The noodles fell across her hair, the sauce dripping onto her shoulders, steaming in the cool air of the hall. Gasps filled the room. Some guests looked horrified, others covered their mouths, and a few laughed nervously. Adrian leaned closer, his voice dripping with cruelty. "Get it now, dumbass?" The room was silent except for the faint sound of dripping sauce. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, not to cry but to steady her breath. She did not shout or scream. She did not throw the plate back at him. She simply straightened herself, wiped her face with the corner of her apron, and continued to stand tall. Inside, however, she felt the sting, not only of the pasta on her skin but of the insult to her dignity. Yet even in that moment, Grace knew something Adrian did not. Humiliation can never truly touch a person who refuses to give away their self-respect. Around the table, whispers began. Some guests looked at Adrian with discomfort, They had come to his home for a display of wealth, but what they had witnessed was a display of cruelty. Grace, though silent, commanded more respect in her calm composure than Adrian did in his tailored blue suit. Still, Adrian felt powerful. He turned back to his meal as if nothing had happened, laughing loudly to break the tension. He believed he had won the moment, proving to everyone that he controlled not only money but also people. But destiny has a strange way of turning tables. What Adrian did not know was that only minutes later, the same floor where he stood in pride would become the ground on which he knelt in desperation. The guests would remember the night not for his wealth or his power, but for the fall of a man who mistook cruelty for strength and underestimated the quiet resilience of a woman who refused to bow to humiliation. And so, as the pasta steamed gently in Grace's hair and the hall filled with uneasy silence, the stage was set. Pride had spoken loudly, but humility was waiting patiently for its turn. Grace walked out of the dining hall with quiet steps, the sound of her shoes barely noticeable against the polished marble. The sauce clung to her uniform, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce filling her nose, but she did not flinch. In the mirror by the hallway, she caught her own reflection. Strands of pasta were tangled in her hair, her face marked with the redness of humiliation. Yet when she looked into her own eyes, she saw calmness, not defeat. She had endured worse storms in her life, and she would not let this moment break her. She found the small service room near the kitchen and took off her apron. She rinsed her face with cold water, the drops sliding down her cheeks. For a few moments, she closed her eyes and remembered her mother's words. Her mother had always told her that dignity was like a flame inside the heart. People could throw dirt, they could throw insults, but if one protected the flame, it would never go out. Grace whispered those words silently, steadying herself. Meanwhile, in the hall, the mood had shifted. The guests who had come for an evening of laughter and networking now carried unease in their eyes. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads at Adrian's behavior. One woman in a red dress leaned toward her friend and said softly, "That was cruel. It was unnecessary." Another man frowned, staring at Adrian as if questioning the arrogance he once admired. Adrian, however, was blind to these changes. He filled his glass with wine, raised it as though making a toast, and laughed loudly. He believed his guests still admired him, still envied his control over everything in his home. To him, humiliating Grace was a way of proving power. He did not realize that in the silence left behind, people had begun to see his weakness instead of his strength. Grace returned quietly, her uniform freshly changed, her hair tied neatly again. She walked back into the hall with her head high, her steps steady. The pasta stain was gone, but the memory of the humiliation lingered in the air. Yet what struck the guests was not her stained uniform or the sauce. It was her silence. She had not shouted, had not begged, had not retaliated. She simply continued with her work, as though determined to show that no insult could steal her grace. Adrian noticed her return and smirked. He thought her silence meant submission, that she was too weak to resist. He leaned closer to one of his business partners and whispered with a laugh, "See? Some people are born to serve." The partner forced a smile, but deep down he felt discomfort. He had once admired Adrian's sharpness, but now he saw cruelty wearing a mask of confidence. Grace continued to serve quietly. As she placed a fresh glass of water before Adrian, her hands did not shake. Her voice was soft but steady as she said, "Your water, sir." That simple moment carried more strength than Adrian realized. For in her silence, she had not given him the victory he believed he had won. Minutes later, the evening took a turn Adrian had not expected. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it at first, but the buzzing continued, urgent and insistent. Finally, with a frown, he picked it up. His face shifted as he read the messages. His largest deal, the one that had promised to triple his fortune, had collapsed. Investors were withdrawing, shares were plummeting, and within hours, years of reputation were beginning to crack. His heart raced as he dialed his lawyer, but the call went unanswered. He dialed again, and again there was no response. His voice grew louder, more desperate, catching the attention of his guests. "This cannot be happening," he muttered. "It is impossible." His hands trembled as he held the phone, his once smooth confidence now replaced with visible panic. The guests watched, their conversations dying down into silence. They saw a man who only minutes ago had mocked a woman with pasta, now trembling at a single message on a screen. Some exchanged glances, realizing that wealth and pride were fragile masks that could break in a moment. Adrian stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "I need to step out," he said, his voice uneven. He rushed toward the hallway, leaving the grand dining hall in confusion. The guests were left in whispers, wondering what could shake a man like Adrian Cole. Grace, still standing by the table, did not move. She had heard his panic, seen his pale face, but she did not smile or gloat. Instead, she carried on with her duties. To her, the moment was not about revenge. It was about patience. She knew that life had its own way of balancing the scales. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and sometimes dignity was the greatest strength one could carry. In the hallway, Adrian collapsed into a chair, his breath uneven. He tried to dial again, but every call went unanswered. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, but in 5 minutes his empire was beginning to crack. The pasta he had thrown, the laughter he had forced, all seemed meaningless compared to the storm now at his door. Back in the dining hall, Grace poured water into another guest's glass, her hands steady, her eyes calm. Around her, people looked at her differently now. Some saw the strength she carried in her silence. Others realized that the true power in that room was not Adrian's wealth, but Grace's unbroken dignity. As the night continued, the balance of power shifted silently. The man who had mocked now trembled, and the woman who had been humiliated stood tall. The story was not finished yet, but already the lesson was beginning to take shape. Arrogance falls quickly, but dignity endures. The laughter that once filled the hall began to fade, replaced by whispers and uneasy glances. Adrian's sudden exit had left his guests in confusion. They had come to celebrate his power, to witness the strength of his success, but now they were watching the unraveling of a man who had built his life on pride. In the hallway, Adrian pressed his phone to his ear again and again, but the calls went unanswered. Each second felt heavier, pressing against his chest like a weight he could not push away. His forehead glistened with sweat, and his polished shoes tapped nervously against the floor. Inside the dining room, Grace continued her quiet work. She cleared plates, refilled glasses, and moved with the same calmness she had carried before. Her presence, once unnoticed, now drew the eyes of the guests. They had seen her humiliated, yet here she was, steady and unbroken, while the master of the house faltered in the shadows. Some of the guests exchanged thoughtful glances. One whispered, "Did you see her face?" She didn't even react. Another nodded, adding, "That's strength you can't buy." Their respect was shifting. Quietly, from the millionaire to the maid, Adrian returned moments later, trying to mask the panic written across his features. He forced a smile, straightened his jacket, and clapped his hands as though nothing had happened. "Business never sleeps," he said with a hollow laugh. "Just a small issue to handle. Nothing serious." But his voice carried a tremor and his eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. He sat down again, but the air in the room had changed. The guests no longer looked at him with admiration. Their conversations were shorter, their laughter less sincere. Adrian noticed it, and for the first time in years he felt the sting of insecurity. His arrogance, once his shield, now felt like a mask that was slipping away. He reached for his wine glass, his hand shaking slightly, and took a sip that did little to steady him. Grace entered quietly with a tray of fresh bread. She placed it on the table, her movements smooth and deliberate. Adrian's eyes flicked toward her, and for a brief moment he felt anger rise again, wanting to lash out and remind everyone of his power. But then his phone buzzed once more. He snatched it up, his heart pounding as he read the message. The words cut deeper than any insult. Contract canceled. Partners pulled out. Shares dropping fast. His hand slipped and the phone nearly fell from his grasp. The silence in the room thickened. Adrian's forced smile disappeared. His breath grew shallow. He stood up, his voice louder than before. "I need to step away for a moment." But instead of leaving with confidence, he stumbled, knocking against the edge of the table. A glass fell, shattering on the marble floor. The guests gasped, some rising to their feet. Adrian's hands shook as he tried to compose himself, but his body betrayed him. The image of control he had carefully built over years was collapsing in minutes. Grace bent down quietly to pick up the broken glass. She gathered the pieces carefully, her face calm, her hands steady, while Adrian stood frozen. The sight was almost symbolic. the maid cleaning up the broken pieces while the millionaire stood helpless. The guests watched in silence, their eyes moving from Adrian's trembling hands to Grace's composed figure. Without saying a word, the contrast between them spoke volumes. Adrian excused himself again and rushed into the hallway, his breath uneven. He leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He thought of the investors who had once praised him, the magazines that had printed his face, the parties where he was the center of attention. Now in the span of minutes, all of it seemed to crumble. His empire was not as untouchable as he had believed. Fear wrapped around him like chains, and for the first time he felt powerless. Back in the hall, the guests began to talk quietly among themselves. Some decided to leave early, slipping away from the table with polite excuses. Others stayed, curious to see what would happen next. They had come expecting a night of glamour, but what they were witnessing felt more like a lesson. One guest whispered, "You can see it, can't you? The higher he climbed, the harder he's falling." Another replied softly, "And look at her, she hasn't lost her balance once." Grace continued her work without showing any sign of triumph. She did not need to. Her strength lay in her composure, in her refusal to let someone else's cruelty define her. She poured another glass of water, adjusted the flowers at the center of the table, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always had. Yet in the eyes of the guests, she was no longer invisible. She had become the center of the story without speaking a word. Adrian returned once more, but this time there was no laughter in his voice. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He sat heavily in his chair, his eyes staring at the table but not seeing it. The phone in his hand buzzed again, and with each message his shoulders sank lower. The words repeated in his mind: loss, collapse, failure. He had built his life on control, but now control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Grace approached quietly and placed a glass of water before him. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that night. In her calm gaze, he saw something he had never noticed before: strength, dignity, and a kind of power that did not come from money. For a moment he felt a strange sense of shame, as if her silence was a mirror reflecting all his flaws. He lowered his eyes, unable to hold her steady gaze. The guests saw it too. They watched the man who had mocked and humiliated now sitting in silence, his arrogance stripped away. They saw the woman he had tried to belittle standing tall in her quiet strength. The contrast was undeniable. Respect was shifting, and Adrian knew it. The empire he had spent years building was crumbling, and in that very room, he realized something more painful. All the wealth in the world could not protect him from humility. The night was far from over, but already the story had begun to turn. The millionaire who had once believed himself untouchable was facing the cracks in his pride, while the maid he had humiliated carried the flame of dignity that no insult could extinguish. And as the chandelier above sparkled with cold light, the guests understood that they were not just attending a dinner. They were witnessing the sudden turn of a man's life, a moment when arrogance began to crumble and humility stood waiting at the door. The air in the grand dining hall had grown heavy. The sparkle of the chandelier above no longer felt like a symbol of wealth, but like a cruel reminder of how quickly power could fade. Guests who once looked at Adrian with admiration now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The music that had played softly in the background seemed too loud in the silence, every note bouncing against the walls of a room that no longer felt secure. Adrian sat at the head of the table, his posture slumped. His phone lay face down before him, but the constant vibrations betrayed the flood of messages he was trying to ignore. Each buzz carried news of more investors leaving, more contracts dissolving, more doors closing. He had built his empire like a fortress, but tonight, the walls were crumbling. He lifted his glass and drained it quickly. But even the taste of expensive wine could not wash away the bitter taste of failure that filled his mouth. The guests watched him carefully. They had once envied his confidence, admired his fortune, and hung on his every word. But now they saw a man stripped of control, exposed in his vulnerability. Some pitied him, others judged him, but all of them knew they were witnessing something rare: the fall of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Grace continued her work in silence, moving steadily from one guest to another. She collected plates, replaced empty glasses, and carried herself with a calmness that seemed to fill the space Adrian had lost. People noticed her more than they ever had before. Where Adrian's hands trembled, hers were steady. Where his voice cracked, hers remained quiet and sure. Without trying, she had become the anchor in a room that felt like it was sinking. Adrian's thoughts raced as he sat there, staring at the tablecloth without seeing it. He remembered the empire he had built, the endless meetings, the sleepless nights, the deals that had made him a fortune. He remembered the interviews where he had been praised as a genius, the articles that called him unstoppable, the speeches where he had declared that failure was something only the weak experienced. Now all of those words mocked him. For the first time in years, he felt truly small. One of the guests leaned over to another and whispered, "He doesn't look like the same man, does he?" The other nodded, replying quietly, "No." And look at her, still standing tall, after what he did to her. They glanced at Grace, who was pouring water into glasses as if nothing could disturb her. Her silence had become louder than Adrian's laughter ever had. Adrian tried to regain control of the evening. He straightened his jacket, forced a smile, and spoke loudly. "Friends, business can be unpredictable. A setback is only temporary. Tomorrow, everything will be back in order." But his voice shook and the guests did not believe him. They exchanged looks, their doubt clear. His words, once commands, now sounded like pleas. Grace walked past him with a tray, and he caught the faint scent of soap from her freshly washed uniform. He glanced up at her, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. He expected to see judgment or perhaps triumph, but instead he saw calmness, almost compassion. That look unsettled him more than any message on his phone. He had humiliated her publicly, yet she carried no hatred in her eyes. That quiet strength made him feel even smaller. As the minutes passed, more guests began to leave. They made polite excuses, praising the food or thanking him for the invitation, but their eyes betrayed their discomfort. They no longer wanted to be associated with a man whose empire was collapsing. Adrian watched them go, each departure cutting deeper into his pride. These were people who had once begged for his attention, who had fought for a place at his table. Now they were slipping away without hesitation. By the time the clock neared midnight, only a few guests remained. The room that had once buzzed with laughter and conversation now felt hollow. The grand table, still half filled with food, looked abandoned. Adrian sat slouched in his chair, his phone still buzzing, his glass empty. He looked around and realized the truth he had never wanted to face. Wealth could buy company, but it could not buy loyalty. The people he had surrounded himself with were not friends. They were shadows that disappeared the moment the light dimmed. And yet in the middle of his loneliness, Grace was still there. She moved from table to table, clearing dishes, her face calm and her posture unbroken. She had every reason to walk away after the humiliation she had suffered, but she stayed. She had not done so for him, but because she had made a promise to herself long ago, to do every task with dignity, no matter how small or how thankless. That quiet resolve shone brighter than any chandelier. Adrian rubbed his temples, his mind spinning. He thought about the pasta he had thrown, the laughter he had forced from his guests, the arrogance that had made him believe he was above everyone else. Now he felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. The cruel joke he had made at Grace's expense returned to him like an echo, reminding him that pride always comes before the fall. The silence of the nearly empty hall was broken only by the sound of Grace's footsteps. They were steady, measured, and calm. Adrian listened to them and something inside him began to shift. For the first time in years, he envied not wealth, not power, but dignity. He realized that Grace had something he could not buy, something he had never learned to earn. When the last guest finally left, Adrian found himself alone at the table with Grace. The chandeliers still burned. The plates still gleamed, but the energy of the night was gone. He looked at her, his pride shattered, his voice trembling. He wanted to say something, an apology perhaps, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he lowered his eyes, ashamed to meet hers. Grace placed the final tray on the sideboard and folded her hands before her. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence carried more weight than any words could. Adrian felt it pressing on him, a mirror reflecting his weakness, a reminder of the cruelty he had shown. For the first time, Adrian Cole, the millionaire who had built an empire of power, felt truly exposed. Not in front of investors or politicians, but in front of the woman he had tried to humiliate. And in that exposure, he realized the truth he had denied his whole life. Wealth could build walls, but it could not protect him from the loneliness that came when those walls collapsed. And so, beneath the glow of the chandeliers, in a hall that had once echoed with his laughter, Adrian sat in silence. Alone, vulnerable, and stripped of pride, he faced the one person who had never needed wealth to be strong. The grand dining hall was silent now. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the shallow praise of guests, all of it had vanished into the night. Only the chandeliers remained, glowing coldly above, casting long shadows on the marble floor. Adrian sat slouched at the head of the table, his suit wrinkled, his glass empty, his phone buzzing uselessly with more bad news. Every vibration made him wince. Each message confirmed what he had already begun to accept. His empire was falling apart, faster than he could stop it. He leaned forward, pressing his palms against his face. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The man who once commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will now sat trembling in his own home. The silence of the hall pressed against him, louder than any storm. Grace moved quietly through the room, collecting dishes, her movements calm and steady. She did not look at Adrian with judgment nor with triumph. She carried out her duties as she always had, her face composed, her back straight. Yet her presence was no longer invisible. Every step she took echoed in Adrian's mind. Her silence weighed heavier than words, reminding him of the cruelty he had unleashed earlier. Adrian's throat felt dry, but he could not bring himself to ask for water. His pride, though broken, still clung to him like a chain. He glanced at Grace, wanting to speak, but the words refused to come. He lowered his eyes again, ashamed. His phone buzzed once more. With trembling hands, he turned it over. The message struck him harder than any before. Final investors out. Accounts frozen. Prepare for collapse. His stomach twisted. His body swayed. He felt the world tilting beneath him. The weight of years of arrogance, years of believing himself untouchable, came crashing down in that single moment. The glassy surface of the table blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had never cried in front of anyone, not even his closest associates. He had built his image on strength, on control, on cold confidence. But tonight all of it crumbled. His chest tightened as he fought for breath, and before he realized it, his knees hit the floor. The sound echoed in the empty hall, a sharp thud of a man falling lower than he had ever imagined. Adrian Cole, the millionaire who had humiliated countless employees, partners, and most recently the maid who now stood before him, was on his knees. His hands trembled as they pressed against the marble. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Please, help me." Grace turned slowly, the tray still in her hands. Her eyes fell on him, and for a moment she froze. The sight before her was surreal. The man who had poured pasta over her head, mocking her dignity, now knelt at her feet, trembling and broken. She placed the tray down carefully and walked toward him. Her steps were unhurried, her face unreadable. Adrian looked up at her with desperate eyes. His voice was uneven, his words clumsy. I am sorry," he stammered. I should not have done that to you. Please, forgive me. Please, Grace." The sound of her name from his lips was strange. He had never used it before. To him, she had always been maid or girl. Now he spoke it as though it were the only anchor keeping him from drowning. Grace stood before him, her posture tall, her expression calm. She did not gloat, did not smirk, did not return his cruelty with cruelty. She simply looked at him with steady eyes. After a long silence, she said softly, "Respect is not something you demand. It is something you earn." Her words struck deeper than any insult could have. Adrian bowed his head lower, tears slipping down his cheeks onto the marble. "I know," he whispered, "I know. I was wrong, please. I don't know what else to do. Everything is gone. Everyone has left me. You are the only one still here." His voice broke into sobs. The sound of a man stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. Grace watched him, her heart steady. She could have turned away. She could have reminded him of his cruelty. She could have walked out and left him alone in his ruin. But she did not. Instead, she walked to the sideboard, poured a glass of water, and returned. She knelt slightly and placed it before him. "Drink," she said simply. Adrian's shaking hands reached for the glass. He lifted it clumsily to his lips and drank deeply, the water spilling down his chin. When he finished, he looked up at her again, his face streaked with tears. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Why are you helping me after what I did? Grace looked at him quietly. Because kindness is not a weakness, she said. And dignity is not something you can take from me. You thought you had power, but power without respect is nothing. Tonight you see it clearly. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room. Adrian felt it sinking into him, dismantling the pride he had carried for years. He lowered his head again, his forehead touching the marble floor. Please forgive me, he whispered. Please. Grace did not respond right away. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment press on him. Finally she said, Forgiveness is not words. Forgiveness is change. If you want forgiveness, change the way you see people.
Change the way you treat them.
That is the only way. Adrian sobbed harder, his body trembling. He nodded, unable to speak. He knew she was right. He had lived a life built on arrogance, and it had brought him to his knees. Now, in the silence of his mansion, in the presence of the woman he had once mocked, he found himself stripped bare. Grace stood slowly and looked down at him one last time. Her voice was calm, but it carried a strength he could never buy. Remember this moment, she said, because wealth can disappear in minutes, but how you treat others stays forever. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him kneeling on the marble floor, his sobs echoing in the emptiness. For Adrian, the lesson had finally arrived, not through books, not through business, but through the quiet dignity of the woman he had tried to break. And in that hall, under the cold glow of the chandeliers, the mighty had fallen to his knees, and the humble had risen without lifting a hand. The house had never felt so heavy. The chandeliers above still burned with steady light, but to Adrian they seemed cold, unforgiving, almost mocking. He remained on the floor long after Grace walked away, his body trembling, his chest tight with sobs he could no longer control. For the first time in his life he had nothing left to hide behind. No reputation, no loyal crowd, no wall of wealth to shield him. He was alone. And in his loneliness he realized just how empty his empire had been. Grace, meanwhile, continued with her work. She collected the last of the dishes, stacked the chairs neatly, and wiped down the polished table. Her movements were deliberate and calm, as though the humiliation she had endured earlier had never happened. To her, dignity was not about revenge or anger, but about maintaining her peace no matter what storm surrounded her. She did not gloat over Adrian's collapse. She did not use the moment to wound him further. Instead, she let her silence speak, her composure more powerful than any cruel word he had thrown at her. Adrian finally rose from the floor, his legs unsteady, his face pale. He walked slowly toward the table where Grace stood, but this time his steps carried none of the arrogance that had once defined him. He moved like a man humbled, stripped of the weight of pride, searching for something he could not name. His voice, when it came, was low and uncertain. I don't deserve to stand in front of you, he said, his words trembling in the air. But I need you to know, I see it now. Everything I thought made me powerful was nothing. You have something I never had. Strength without cruelty, power without arrogance, dignity that I could never buy. Grace looked at him for a long moment. She saw the brokenness in his face, the way his eyes darted nervously, the way his shoulders sagged as if the years of pride were finally pressing down on him. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she finished arranging the cutlery on the sideboard, her composure steady as ever. Then she turned toward him and said softly, You always believed people respected you because of your money, but they feared you. Fear is not respect. Fear is not love. And when fear fades, you are left with nothing. Her words cut deep, but Adrian did not flinch. He nodded slowly, tears welling again in his eyes. You're right, he whispered. I spent my life building walls with money, but I never built bridges with respect. Tonight I see it clearly. Everyone left me, but you stayed. Not because of me, but because of who you are. That is strength I never understood. Grace's eyes softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. I stayed because my dignity is mine. It doesn't change because of what you did. I choose who I am, not you. And that is what you need to learn. Who you are is not your bank account. Who you are is how you treat others when you think no one is watching. Adrian lowered his head, ashamed. Her words replayed in his mind again and again. For years he had measured success by the number of zeros in his bank balance, by the luxury he could display, by the fear he could command. Now kneeling in front of her, he realized none of it had brought him peace. None of it had earned him true respect. The silence after her words felt heavier than any business loss he had ever endured. He thought of the guests who had once clung to him. He remembered their smiles, their shallow praises, their eagerness to share his spotlight. They had left the moment his fortune began to crumble. Not one had stayed. Not one had shown loyalty. And yet here was Grace. The woman he had humiliated most cruelly, still present, still composed, still carrying herself with more power than he had ever displayed. In that moment, Adrian understood that true wealth was not measured in money but in character. He sank back into a chair, exhausted, his hands covering his face. "I don't know if I can change," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I have spent so long being someone else. I don't know if I even know how to be better." Grace stood across from him, her gaze steady. Change is not a speech. Change is not a promise. Change is what you do tomorrow and the day after that and every day after. You cannot undo what you did tonight, but you can choose not to repeat it. That is where it begins. Her words were simple, but they pierced deeper than any grand philosophy he had ever read. He realized she was right. He had thought of life as a game of power and image, but now he saw it as a series of choices. Each moment offered him a chance to choose humility over arrogance, kindness over cruelty, respect over disdain. The weight of his realization was crushing. He leaned back, staring up at the chandelier above. Its glow seemed different now, not a symbol of luxury, but a reminder of the fragility of everything he had built. For years he had lived under its light, entertaining guests, impressing strangers, hiding his emptiness. Tonight it revealed the truth. All the gold in the world could not cover the cracks in his soul. Grace finished her work and folded her hands in front of her. She did not smile, but her presence filled the room with a calm strength Adrian had never known. For the first time, he saw her not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a teacher life had sent at the exact moment he needed it most. She had shown him, without raising her voice, what real power looked like. It was not wealth, it was not fear, it was not arrogance. Real power was the ability to stand tall without tearing others down. Adrian wiped his eyes, his voice shaking as he spoke again. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not for forgiving me, because I know I don't deserve that yet, but for showing me what I could never see. I thought I was strong. Tonight I realize I was weak. You are the strong one, Grace, and I can only hope to learn." Grace nodded once, then turned away, her silence more powerful than any reply. She walked toward the door, her steps steady, her posture tall. Adrian watched her go, his heart heavy but strangely lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, he felt the possibility of change stirring inside him, and as the night drew to its end, one truth remained clear. The man who once believed himself a master of power had been humbled by the quiet strength of a woman who needed no wealth to stand taller than him. The mansion had grown silent, the kind of silence that stretched long into the night and reminded Adrian of how empty grandeur could feel when stripped of laughter and company. The tables were cleared, the guests gone, the wine glasses stacked neatly on the sideboard. The glow of the chandeliers above remained, but instead of shining with celebration, their light revealed only the hollowness of a room where pride had crumbled and arrogance had been exposed. Adrian sat in one of the chairs, staring at nothing. His phone lay dead beside him, its endless stream of bad news finally silenced by a drained battery. He felt drained, too, as though all the life had been pulled from him. The weight of years of arrogance pressed down on his shoulders. He had once believed himself indestructible, but tonight had shown him just how fragile he really was. Grace emerged from the kitchen, her uniform freshly cleaned, her hair neatly tied once again. She moved with the same composure she had always carried, her steps unhurried, her posture upright. She looked at Adrian briefly, but there was no triumph in her eyes, no need to remind him of the pasta he had poured on her head hours earlier. Her silence was enough. It was a silence that spoke of dignity, of strength, of a heart that refused to be broken by cruelty. Adrian swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore." Grace placed the last of the trays on the counter and turned to face him. "You are who you choose to be next," she said simply. Her words hung in the air like a verdict. He stared at her, realizing that the choice was his and always had been. For years he had chosen arrogance, greed, and cruelty. Now life had stripped those choices bare, leaving him with the opportunity to begin again. The thought both terrified and comforted him. He lowered his head. "I don't know if I can change." Grace's voice was calm, steady. Change is not easy, but it starts small. With how you speak, with how you see others, with what you choose in the moments when no one is watching. If you want to change, start there. Her simplicity cut deeper than any lecture. Adrian nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes again. I wish I had seen it sooner. Most people only see when it is too late, Grace replied. But sometimes even then there is still a chance if you take it. Adrian looked at her with a mixture of awe and shame. Here was a woman who had been humiliated by him, mocked in front of his powerful guests, yet she stood taller than anyone he had ever known. She had not let his cruelty define her. Instead, she had carried herself with a strength he had never possessed. He realized that true greatness was not in building empires, but in refusing to let the world take away your humanity. The sound of the clock striking midnight echoed through the hall. Adrian stood slowly, his body heavy with exhaustion. He walked toward Grace, his steps uncertain. I owe you more than an apology, he said quietly. I owe you the truth. I thought I was better than you because I had money. But tonight I saw the truth. You are richer than I will ever be. Rich in dignity, rich in strength, rich in the kind of power money cannot touch. Grace studied him for a moment. She saw sincerity in his eyes, but she also saw how broken he was. She gave a small nod. Then let this night be the beginning, not the end. If you truly understand, live differently. Treat people with respect, not with cruelty. That will speak louder than any apology. Adrian's throat tightened, but he nodded again. I will try. Grace turned and walked toward the door, her back straight, her steps measured. Adrian watched her go, realizing that she carried with her a lesson that would stay with him forever. She did not need to raise her voice, she did not need to fight, she did not need revenge. Her silence, her composure, and her dignity had spoken more loudly than anything he had ever built with his wealth. When the door finally closed behind her, Adrian stood alone in the vast hall. The chandeliers still burned, but the light felt different now. It no longer represented his power. It represented the truth he had learned tonight, that wealth could vanish, friends could leave, and empires could collapse in minutes, but dignity and respect were eternal. The following days were harsh for Adrian. News of his downfall spread quickly through the city. Articles once praising him now questioned his arrogance. Investors who had once fought to sit at his table now turned their backs. The empire he had built over decades dissolved piece by piece. He faced lawsuits, losses, and the humiliation of being forgotten by those who had once begged for his attention. But through it all, the memory of that night remained. The memory of his knees hitting the marble, of his tears falling freely, of Grace's calm eyes looking down at him, not with hatred, but with dignity. That memory became the turning point of his life. He began slowly to change. He treated his staff differently, speaking with respect instead of command. He listened instead of mocking. He sought forgiveness not in words but in actions. It was not an easy journey, and it did not erase his past, but it gave him something he had never known before: humility. Grace continued her life quietly, unchanged by his fall. She still worked with dignity, still carried herself with calm strength. To her, that night was not about revenge, but about proving to herself that no one could steal her self-respect. She had endured humiliation without breaking, and in doing so, she had shown the world and Adrian that real strength comes from within. In time, the story of that night spread quietly among those who had been present. They told it not as gossip, but as a lesson. They spoke of the millionaire who had once believed himself invincible, brought to his knees not by wealth or politics, but by the dignity of a woman he had tried to humiliate. They spoke of Grace, whose silence had been more powerful than any shout, whose calm strength had turned arrogance into humility. And so the lesson endured. Wealth fades, pride crumbles, power shifts, but dignity and respect remain. The true measure of a person is not in what they own, but in how they treat those who serve, those who struggle, those who stand quietly in the shadows. Adrian never forgot that truth. For the rest of his life, he carried the memory of that night like a scar and a blessing. And Grace, she never needed recognition, never needed fame. Her wealth was her dignity, her unshakable strength, and the lesson she carried within her heart. And as the years passed, the story of that night became something greater than a dinner gone wrong. It became a parable, a reminder whispered across tables and boardrooms, in kitchens and offices. Arrogance can fall in minutes, but dignity endures forever.